Hi, welcome to this episode of Obsicast. My guest today is a very special individual to me, Mehran Seyed Emami. He's an Iranian-Canadian psychedelic therapist who has also been my mentor on this path. Mehran is one of the people that I contacted when I decided to study psychedelic therapy, and he has been a companion on this path. First of all, I would like to thank you for all the time and patience that you've had with me over the last couple of years. And thank you so much for joining me on Obsicast. Usually I'm a guest on your Persian podcast. It's so nice to have you here with me in person in London, Mehran. Shall we start from your personal story and how you've ended up on this path? Because you used to be an engineer, and through a number of tragic incidents in your life, you changed your path. Tell us more about your story.
I'm very excited about this conversation. Thank you for inviting me. And I think the word mentor is quite a strong word. I definitely don't see myself in that capacity, but thank you for sharing that with me. And it's been, I'm grateful for having been with you on this path and for sharing what I have shared based on my own lived experience. And that began with the death of my father about 7 years ago in a very unexpected, tragic, unjust, unexpected way where I don't know how much detail I want to go into at this moment, because I don't mean to reinforce potentially the story, the narrative, the idea that somehow I was a victim or our family was a victim of the Iranian regime, because this feels relatively I feel relatively powerless or helpless or inadequate when I give away my power, my agency, my freedoms, how I feel in relation to someone who perceivedly took that away from me or from us. But the story initially, how it goes, is that they, along with 8 other incredible humans who are only meaning to help Iran and its environment and its wildlife, started the NGO, the Persian Wildlife Heritage Foundation, where as one of their initiatives and projects, they were wanting to help rescue, even though nature or wildlife doesn't require rescuing per se, but they wanted to help the Asiatic cheetah, a rare endangered species with only less than 50 left in the world. And they all inhabit very remote, dry, arid lands in Iran, where they would set up camera traps and, like any other NGO, monitor their activities to help repopulate their numbers. And in the fearful, paranoid minds of the Iranian regime, they assumed or perceived or believed in their very fearful minds that they must have an agenda, meaning that they must, who wants to save an animal? Who wants to save nature? Who wants to help, the wildlife? And so they thought that they were tracking missile activities or military activities or spying, and therefore they were accused of being spies for the MI6, for the CIA, and detained. And my father passed away after 2 weeks in jail in the notorious Evin prison, where he was likely physically, psychologically interrogated, pressured, tortured is a strong word, to admit to being a spy. And what I got to experience in an ayahuasca ceremony a year later confirmed that not only did he not speak out against himself or his co-workers, colleagues, or others, that he, until his last moments on this earth, at least in the physical form, and under forced confession, which is what happens in Iran, in countries like ours, unfortunately, he never spoke out or wrote against himself or others. and ultimately died under duress. And so in that ayahuasca ceremony, he went from someone who, according to the lies that were told to us, died by suicide. He actually was willing to live in truth and integrity and embody what he truly believed in, and never for a moment, even in the last 2 weeks of his life, was willing to surrender his freedom or his choice or his agency or his integrity. And he died a hero in not just in my mind, but in my body and my being. And so that was what gave me enough courage, capacity, strength, resilience to now become the man that I am, embody what he embodied, and to be a bridge like he was, to help primarily work with Iranian populations in the Middle East, people who have gone through similar things, to help transform, transcend, transmute their pain, their suffering, their grief into love, even though that might sound a bit esoteric, or help move these energies to see what's on the other side, or to help transform it into service, into connecting, reconnecting not only to our own humanity, but to our communities, our culture, our people, our spaces. And so it's been a very difficult, very challenging, very chaotic, very transformative, I suppose, past couple of years. But here I am, still alive, still breathing, still hopeful, going from a very cold, cruel, dark, malevolent universe to a very kind, abundant, beautiful, and loving universe in a matter of years. Because if I had reinforced the victim mentality or consciousness, then forever I would want to watch the news and just essentially project onto the other or the regime or the government, and always give away my own power to them and for what they did to me or my family. But they only helped reawaken my true purpose, or not them in that sense, but they triggered. It's kind of like igniting a fire, let's call it, or setting a spark to bring me to what I was truly here to embody or do.
Which was?
To reconnect to my soul's purpose. I think psychedelics, and I was thinking about this while coming here, a lot of the words that they help manifest begins with R-E, meaning to remember, to revisit, to reconnect, to rebirth, to reawaken. And the reason I emphasize on is that psychedelics are not necessarily manifesting something new, but rather helping us connect to things that were already there, that we somehow forgot. And so events or traumas may reignite what was already inside in my body, my gut, my intuition, or perhaps from the soul. These are getting a bit tricky to share in words, but ultimately reconnect to the mystical, the spiritual, the transcendental, the other dimensions of consciousness or other dimensions of being. And so I got to experience, with the help of psychedelics, not just the experiences of this lifetime, but how lifetimes have led me here. Again, these are bold and audacious statements, but you have a near-death experience or rebirth experience where you have to die in order to be reborn. And this is not just the experience that I lived in this lifetime, but for many times that story has been playing out until finally this chain can be perhaps broken or reintegrated or find home again, or it's hard to put these things into words, but to find totality, to find wholeness. And so I really, truly do believe that psychedelics not only help us heal what is here and happened in this lifetime, but what has been happening for lifetimes, meaning as ancestral, lineage, generational, but also what is potentially passed on to the generations after us. So I think there's an indigenous saying that you get to heal 7 generations past and 7 generations after, which I truly believe. And these are things, if anyone is listening and wondering, how could you know, or how do you know this, or I don't believe what you're saying, all I would invite or encourage is that these are deeply experiential experiences, meaning until you haven't tried, you don't know. Until you haven't been there, you don't know. These are not things that are meant to be objectively, measurably, materialistically, or tangibly seen or felt, but seen or studied, but rather deeply experientially in our cells, in our bodies, in our gut, in our intuition, felt on a very visceral and spiritual level.
And that could not have happened if there wasn't this major suffering in your life that then transformed you to the degree that you decided to drop everything that they had done until then, to become a psychedelic therapist, dedicate so many years to studying, and to ultimately becoming a healer.
Yes. I feel that there is no greater way to live or be than to share through our stories, through our experiences, through our voice, through the gifts that we all uniquely have with those around us. And so for me, it doesn't feel like I'm a healer or that I am healing, but rather I am hanging out with you. I am meeting you where you are. I am there with you in the depth of your own grief, pain, suffering, without the need to try to change, judge, rush, control, project onto, or take away your suffering in any way. Because I recognize that myself, in my own life, that suffering has been a gift. I don't mean to share this with someone who's just recently gone through something incredibly difficult or painful. And it took me quite some years to get there, where I'm able to reframe and re-perceive suffering as grace, as Ram Dass, one of my teachers, would say. But it truly is something, a fire that can help reignite something deeper, as I just shared earlier. And so I can meet someone, my suffering and yours, and let's meet each other in the shadow, in the dark, and let's just hang out here until potentially there might be a spark of light or an ember that can ultimately become the fire that becomes the next version of who we are in the world.
Incredible. You've had experienced various psychedelic medicines, but you specifically work with MDMA. Why have you chosen to work with MDMA, and how is it different from other medicines?
That's a good question. When people hear MDMA, which is also known as ecstasy, they have an impression that it's only used for recreational, for parties, and for fun. What do you mean MDMA? For healing or therapeutic purposes? Whereas an experience at Burning Man or at a rave or at a festival can be incredibly fun and joyful and euphoric and ecstatic, as the name implies. A lot of your attention may go to the lights, the DJ, the music, the sounds, other people. You want to hug everyone. You want to extend this kind of abundance of the release of so many chemicals, let's call them, from serotonin to dopamine to prolactin to oxytocin, that generates a rush of happy feelings in our bodies. And in the setting that I work in with clients, either one-on-one or in our group experiences, the person is lying down, they have a blindfold on, there's a gentle instrumental music playing in the background, and the whole experience is lying down, focusing on the internal, the introspective, the what is happening inside of their own bodies, what is their intuition calling for, where is their spirit taking them, where is their body leading them, and the body begins to speak, either in very subtle forms or in quite pronounced ways, where, for example, someone might feel something in their chest, and associated with any sensation somewhere in the body, there is usually an emotion or feeling. There is usually a memory that might tie into that. There might be a trauma, capital T or small t trauma, depending on what happened at some point in their lives, which may also reveal itself. But MDMA quiets down the part of the brain and the parts of us that are afraid or reactive or not wanting to go there. So we are actually able to stay with that sensation, with that feeling, with that memory, with that trauma, without needing to run away. Because we either go into hypervigilance or fight or flight when something, remembering a traumatic event, or we go into hypoarousal, which is shut down, freeze, and disassociation. And so this allows us to stay grounded in the middle, where I'm able to be with it without needing to do anything or react emotionally or be too afraid or overwhelmed. And so it's a beautiful opportunity to allow something that didn't have a chance to complete itself to now in real time be revisited, felt, experienced, and then integrated back into the system, integrated back into the whole. So it's no longer fragmented or scattered or disassociated or not part of me. So I need to own, in my case, with my father's death, I had to own the sadness, the grief, the anger, the rage, the tuning out, the dissociation, the numbness, all of it. And I had to welcome in all of these parts, while recognizing that it was all me. And the degree to which I didn't recognize it in myself, I kept projecting it outward, meaning that if I don't deal with my own anger, then I kept running into angry people. In fact, at one point early on, after my father had died, I ran into a person who had the same name, the same avatar presented in two different beings or humans who were incredibly angry. And it got me to realize that this is just me projecting my own anger onto the people and circumstance that were coming into my life. And so until we don't deal with or confront or integrate our own parts, then we will continue to play out this story that it lives outside of me. Or we go into the game of fear, guilt, blame, shame, fearing, guilting, blaming, shaming others, rather than owning that this is all existing within me. And if I can heal myself, then I can operate and work and live in a world where I'm no longer giving away my power and how I feel and my freedom to others. And why MDMA? Because I personally benefited from it tremendously, for my own overactivated nervous system, for my dysregulated system. Plant medicines like ayahuasca that I had worked with prior to my father passing just a few months earlier, I had fortunately, now looking back, incredibly grateful for the opportunity to have worked with it in Peru with the Shipibo people in a very indigenous, ceremonial, beautiful setting where they would sing songs called Icaros and help invite certain energies, ward off certain energies, create a beautiful and safe container where masters of the work that they did, having an incredibly close relationship with the ayahuasca plant and its spirit, and therefore feeling just at home. It was an experience that gave me enough capacity to get through what was about to be a very, very tumultuous, chaotic, and challenging period in my life. And so after my father passed, when I went to revisit ayahuasca a year later, this time I wasn't able to feel grounded. I wasn't able to feel safe. I wasn't able to feel like I could surrender. And I just felt overwhelmed. I felt like I was resisting the experience, and therefore I had what some may call a bad trip, where it just felt like I was in a washing machine being twisted and tumbled and thrown around, or a pinball in a pinball machine, just kind of going in all directions, but not knowing what to do with it. So for me personally, the more gentle, heart-opening medicines like MDMA was what I personally uniquely needed in order to find healing through more gentle, subtle ways. Plant medicines like mushrooms or ayahuasca or others can also invite incredibly soft, gentle, loving, beautiful experiences as well. But they can also be very direct and fierce and not beat around the bush, and can be quite intense and challenging, especially for someone who hasn't had any prior experience with any other medicine. So I suppose arbitrarily, another way to look at it is that MDMA in the vast ecosystem of psychedelics is a let's call it a beginner's psychedelic. Let's call it entry psychedelic. Let's call it psychedelic where it's very hard to have a quote unquote bad trip with. And so finally, I also didn't feel qualified or ready or having developed enough of a relationship with these sacred indigenous plants that have been used from Central America, South America to different countries, cultures, tribes, and places for hundreds, if not thousands of years, where it's passed on through oral traditions, through generations. And I just didn't feel that I was qualified. I didn't feel that I was called by the mushrooms or by these medicines to work with them. And I just hold such deep respect, reverence, that I didn't want to potentially create harm for anyone. And so with MDMA, because I've worked with it, because I've developed a close relationship with it, and I can, to a large degree, recognize its impacts, its consequences, and its effects on a person, even though I am also surprised quite often, and still learning and still a student, but it's a medicine that I feel drawn to and comfortable working with. Yeah.
One of my questions about the MDMA is that can it really be categorized as a psychedelic? Because a lot of people would never have any visions, at least the people that I have worked with. But I heard from you that some of your clients have had ayahuasca-esque experiences with MDMA.
Yes, I have lived experience of this, at least according to their testimonies and what they've shared with me. I'm trying to think of an example where that was true. I had the privilege, the opportunity to work with someone who was struggling with MS for 6 or 7 years. And she had found me through the podcast, through social media, and reached out to me. And initially, I was quite reluctant and quite hesitant. I wasn't sure if I felt that this is safe or that this is the appropriate route. She was already on medication for this condition. And just for a moment to open a tangent, I suppose, what is MS and how does it manifest? Why is it that so many of us experience autoimmune conditions? And this may sound like, again, another bold statement for me to share or to say, and it might sound even reductionistic, but I, with my limited perspective, believe that an autoimmune condition is the body's way of rejecting itself or attacking itself or going out against itself. And so she would share stories with me that as far as she remembers, when she looked in the mirror, she didn't like her own body, or that she would somehow be judgmental or not loving and therefore critical of herself. And so are we really surprised that the body then manifests something we call MS, which can then be diagnosed, which can be medicated, which can be identified with, and then become your whole life, which is revolving around this condition, this diagnosis, this identification. And yet there was a part of her, perhaps her gut, her intuition, that felt like the medication didn't necessarily serve her. And her gut told her that she wants to try something different, something perhaps controversial, something contradictory, something that any specialist, surgeon, doctor, psychiatrist, not all of them, I don't mean to speak in absolute terms, but many might say, you're crazy. Why would you do that? Why put yourself at risk? This is dangerous. And oftentimes with psychedelics, for people who haven't experienced it themselves, they tend to project their own fears onto it, meaning that because they are afraid of what it may reveal, because it is walking into the unknown, it is walking into uncertainty, it is walking into new, uncharted territory. And for many people, and most people, they prefer the familiar, comfortable, known, rather than the unfamiliar, uncomfortable, unknown. And so she ultimately trusted and felt safe enough and ready enough to work with me. And with MDMA, she got to go as far back as being in her mother's womb, and even remembering, and this gets a bit explicit here, that her birth was a product of violence, that her father had used sex and intercourse as a violent and aggressive act against his wife. And that's how my client was born, out of almost a sense or an energy of violence, and that she wasn't supposed to be here, quote unquote. And that ever since she was born, it just felt like she doesn't belong, and therefore feeling isolated, disconnected, rejecting of her own place, autonomy, agency in this world. And so later on, she develops, and what is manifested is a process of an autoimmune condition called MS. And she got to revisit these places, which can normally be quite challenging and difficult, but MDMA allows us to be equanimous enough and grounded enough and safe enough, I hope, in most cases, this has been the case, where we're able to navigate and sit with and be with and process and reintegrate these very challenging parts from our birth to now, and ultimately help work with these energies, work with the emotions, the feelings. For her, it was a lot of anger, a lot of rage that had to come up to be moved. And by the way, anger and rage doesn't necessarily have to come up and manifest as a scream or as, these ways that we normally associate with. It might come in a shake, a tremor, a yawn, a tear. It can manifest in many different ways. And ultimately, she just was able to feel incredibly settled, peaceful, accepting, forgiving, and appreciative of her place in the world. And what do you know? The MS symptoms disappeared. Again, these sound like, oh my God, that's a miracle. Yes, psychedelics can be miraculous. And these are, again, very big statements, but only if, I preface this, if we are feeling called, if we are feeling ready, if we are feeling safe, if we are feeling trusting, if we are cautious, careful, prepared before we ever actually experience. Because I really do want to name the flip side of someone prematurely having these experiences without being ready or without being called, just based on something they had heard, or just based on wanting to fix or change, force, control, but rather truly trust, welcome, receive, and there are very different ways that one can approach these sacred medicines. And yes, I do consider MDMA, even though synthetic, even though created in a lab, as being intelligent, as having intelligence, as having a living spirit. And I invite and encourage people before ingesting the medicine to actually see if there's any gratitude for themselves, for the medicine, speaking their intention, and 3 questions that I, along with many of my colleagues and people in this space, ask: do you feel safe with me? Do you feel safe with this medicine? Do you feel safe in this space? And only if the answer is yes to all 3 questions will we proceed, will we go ahead, and will be able to, hopefully without any resistance, surrender into the experience and ultimately allow it to take us where we need to go.
Mm-hmm. Often MDMA is a medicine that is described as very powerful when it comes to treating PTSD. How many sessions does one need to heal?
The honest answer is I don't know. I think it depends on that person's unique context, on their level of preparedness, of their level of their willingness, their belief in the potential or possibility of healing. If someone comes in skeptical, if someone comes in thinking I've tried everything and nothing works, if someone comes in thinking that this is just another thing that I'm going to try, knowing that it's probably not going to work for me, then it'll probably be a self-fulfilling prophecy and therefore not reveal what ultimately can be revealed, and or the healing that is just at the touch of our fingers and so close and so available and so abundant. Yet we oftentimes, unfortunately, tend to get in our own way and tend to create obstacles or create resistance or create barriers between ourselves and healing, between ourselves and love. MDMA is only manifesting a deep sense of love and appreciation and acceptance and welcoming. Yet the parts of me that thinks I'm not good enough, that I'm not deserving of love, that I'm not deserving of healing, that I don't believe in healing, then that is getting in the way of my own healing, ironically, paradoxically. And so it's not a matter of how many times or the dosage, but really intuitively feeling drawn to it, knowing that I am ready, knowing that I feel trusting, knowing that I am able to finally surrender, knowing that the familiar known has become so painful that I'm willing to walk the unfamiliar unknown, that I'm willing to try something new, that I'm willing to walk into uncharted terrain, that I'm willing to now walk into the fire, because that is the courage and the choice that we have in relation to whatever pain, suffering, trauma, PTSD that we have experienced. If someone keeps reinforcing the story that I was identified or diagnosed with PTSD, and they've created a whole story, narrative, life revolving around that due to whatever tragic and rightfully so and justifiably so and understandably so that they, for example, witnessed a death or were a veteran of a war or were a humanitarian aid worker or a war reporter or whatever it might have been. But it almost has become so deeply embedded and over-identified with that they are actually more comfortable with the pain, with the suffering, with the depression, with the PTSD, than recognizing, even allowing the possibility of who they'd be without PTSD. And they don't know, and they're afraid of that. Like, who am I beyond my suffering? I was afraid to know that. Who am I beyond my dad's story? Who am I? You know, Gabor Mate is an incredible author, specialist in addiction and trauma, has written many books and lives in Vancouver, where I live. And he, and there's a little bit of a judgmental energy, even though I consider him a teacher, a mentor, someone who I've learned with and benefited from incredibly. In fact, it was him who heard about our family's story and introduced me to the California Institute of Integral Studies, or CIIS, in the Bay Area in the US, where I did my master's degree and then subsequently psychedelic therapy training. I wonder, he's now in the latter years of his life, and yet in most interviews, podcasts, and places, and lectures, he is sharing the story of being born in Budapest, Hungary during the World War, and how he experienced this incredibly painful, not just birth, but the early years of his life. And parts of me wonder, when we repeat a narrative, a story, then are we releasing it, or are we potentially reinforcing it? And this is why I was cautious early on when you asked to share my own story, because to what degree is that my lived experience, and to what degree have I separated from it enough to know that there are other ways of being beyond that? And so it's a tricky place, because we are experiencing almost multiple personalities or lifetimes or dimensions and ways of being. And then there's one, there are stories that can pull us in and remind us of old patterns, old ways of being, and kind of, our own families are the best example of this. They keep reinforcing the identities that a lot of us have began to shed or no longer identify with, yet they see us and still believe we're the people we were 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, a year ago, even though we are constantly changing, adapting, evolving, and manifesting in so many different ways. Yet families, stories, cultures, narratives can suck us right back in. So this is a practice of someone who works with psychedelics and the process of integration to know how to now embody the new version of themselves and be wary of old stories, of old patterns. And so I think I went on a bit of a tangent there, but hopefully that came through.
Fascinating, because in fact, it's Eckhart Tolle who uses the term pain body. And he says that a lot of people define themselves with the pain that they have experienced and the suffering they have experienced. And you can't really live in the moment unless you are ready to shed it, take off that body of pain that you have wrapped yourself in order to live a healthy life in the now and in the moment. But it's very difficult for a lot of people, because that's what defines them, their suffering.
Yes. Yes. Yes, and it's almost like a cactus that we're hugging. And then at some point, when do you finally want to let go? You don't need to hug it forever. Suffering can be a beautiful teacher. It can be a beautiful gift. It can be a beautiful gateway. It can be a beautiful metamorphosis. It can be the metaphor of how this underwater predator, which eventually somehow recognizes that it's being pulled away and out of the water, everything it knows. And why would it make that leap of faith out into the air, out of the water, out in towards the sun? And without it even knowing, there's such a deep remembering that there is something more inside of it that, and I'm trying to remember this story properly, but this is how that underground predator becomes a dragonfly, which ultimately there's like this incredible metamorphosis that takes shape, where it begins to grow like a spine, which is like another metaphor for resilience, and find this like incredible way of growing these like delicate, fragile, beautiful, colorful, magical, psychedelic wings, where it all of a sudden, becomes a dragonfly that we know of. But do we ever question, like, how did the butterfly become the butterfly, or the dragonfly become the dragonfly? It's not like they were doing something. It was just nature expressing itself through them. It was the power of sun, like photosynthesis, like the way a plant grows. We are planting, we are humaning, we are expressing. Nature is expressing through us. And my father, I'm so eternally grateful to him for having shown us nature from a young age, for having grown up in places where nature was abundant, where we would hike and camp and sit around the fire and enjoy the stars and just feel connected to the earth. And nature has been such an important part and constant part of my journey. Now living in Vancouver, the best way for me to feel at home or in my element or belonging or even connect to my father has been through nature. And so it is painful to let go and to shed and to drop and to it's the Lord of the Rings, Frodo and Sam, it's walking into the fire. And a lot of people are afraid to do that. And they are choosing to stay with, to be with the identification with suffering or depression rather than something else.
Mm-hmm. But then there's the psychedelics, and it can really change your relationship with your suffering. You reach a point that you may become grateful for the suffering. But in my case, I couldn't have experienced that if it wasn't for ayahuasca. And that's the beauty of psychedelics. It just changes your perspective, and then you realize that suffering happens because you need to spiritually grow. And in fact, we have it a lot in Persian mysticism as well. And this is where I want to ask you about: how do you see psychedelics and the Middle Eastern, specifically Persian, mysticism and spirituality?
That's a good question. I don't think I'm informed enough, educated enough, deeply connected, oddly, to my own heritage, enough to be able to give a concise, clear, answer to that question. But one memory comes up for me when I was in Peru in 2017. And the curandero ayahuasquero maestro is normally how they are identified, and not necessarily a shaman who was working with the plant, said that you Persians, like, you get it. He was looking into my eyes and feeling as if, that depth of remembering that I mentioned is quite strong in us. We've gone through incredibly painful but beautiful stories. And we are now born in this incarnation, in this body, in this culture, in this family. For me, during the Iran-Iraq War, a country polarized, divided, under duress, under stress, quite traumatized. Many Persians either remember the revolution as something traumatizing, or the war, or immigration, or having to leave their countries against their own will, or feeling a lack of belonging, or whatever it might be. And so Persians have gone through a lot, not just in this lifetime, but historically and traditionally. And so this is where, with pain and suffering, has come these beautiful traditions that we have, where I'm trying to remember a few of them. Our poetry, which is the most tightly cliche or obvious one, or when I would travel, my grandmother would blow espand. Espand, I think it's Syrian rue, which is cracked and smokes, and as a way to ward off bad energies or spirits, or create good fortune or luck or abundance. I'm not sure why exactly it was used, but I remember the distinct smell of espand, which, by the way, a side note, some claim are actually, I've experienced it in combination with mushrooms, not by itself, which can almost amplify and induce ayahuasca-like visions when worked and combined with mushrooms. Wild Syrian rue, some may refer to it as silohuasca when these two medicines are combined. There's soma, which is, again, arguably, debatedly, an ancient psychedelic, psychoactive brew, also potentially based in Syrian rue, that we, at some point, perhaps during the Zoroastrian period or latter, and somehow got lost in history, that this was something that we had used and that is familiar to us. And so I think for Persians and Iranians, the veil that separates us from the mystical, from the spiritual, from the transcendent is quite narrow, meaning that it's not such a leap, it's not such a jump, it's not so distant, but rather quite available. And just in response to what you shared, that without ayahuasca, you perhaps were not able to transcend your suffering. Um, a part of me really wants to emphasize that it's not only psychedelics that can help us get there. I think many people do experience quite mystical and spiritual things on a regular basis. We can call it a spontaneous event where we might dream of someone or think of someone and they call us, or we can dream the future or see things beyond the veil, or it can manifest in many different ways. And so I really do believe that it's not only psychedelics that can help us get there, that it's actually quite close, but it just requires a little bit of groundedness, presence in the here and now, to actually listen enough to the subtle signs that are always presenting themselves. But I, in my vigor to try to chase and seek and find and control and force and heal and fix and all the rushing and running in our hyper individualistic, societies that we live in, we never actually allow things to come to us anymore. So I would like to think that when we're still enough, that many of these miracles or magic can happen. Yeah.
Lovely. So you are very lucky to live in Canada, where MDMA therapy is legal. What's your prediction for the next 5 to 10 years globally when it comes to legalization for psychedelic-assisted therapies?
Again, I don't know. I think there was surprising for some, unsurprising, not so surprising for others, relative pushback more recently with the FDA's decision in the US to reject MAPS, which is a multidisciplinary association of psychedelic studies, who has been groundbreaking, amazing, incredible work since, I believe, in the 80s, to help legalize and regulate MDMA for therapeutic use. Without going too much into the details, of the 11 people, I believe, on the panel who were voting on this, I believe physicians, psychiatrists, health professionals, from their perspective, perhaps because they hadn't experienced it themselves or didn't know enough about it, or were projecting their own fears onto it, or a slightly controversial comment, bought and sold by the pharmaceutical companies who don't want MDMA to become legal, they rejected MDMA therapy, even though the clinical trials, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials had proven without question, quite objectively, quite rigorous studies and trials showing how incredibly beneficial it was to the various populations, primarily people who had suffered with PTSD. MDMA therapy can be. And it's very important to emphasize that it's not just MDMA, but MDMA combined with therapy, which is what gives it and amplifies and really creates this container and capacity for healing. Because if someone just takes MDMA without knowing what it is, or without having perhaps at least a trip sitter, and then up to a psychedelic therapist where they feel safe and trusting with next to them, then when a moment of fear, anxiety arises, they may feel the need to resist or leave the room or take their fold or blindfold off, or step out of the experience. And so these clinical trials, research, and MDMA therapy, what it helps with is creating the safety where the person can just surrender introspectively, internally to the experience. And for the FDA, they have never regulated or legalized a therapy. They had only regulated or legalized a drug, quote unquote, meaning that for them, it just didn't make any sense what the therapy component or aspect of MDMA therapy was. For them, it only makes sense to legalize, a drug that later becomes patented and then is over-medicated, unfortunately, and oversold. Whereas with MDMA and MDMA therapy, one could have one experience that can last a lifetime. Although the protocol that MAPS did, I believe they had 3 MDMA experiences over a certain time period, for example, a couple of weeks or a couple of months, to really, I guess, drive it home, even though I personally don't necessarily believe that most cases, more than one MDMA session with enough preparation and enough integration can be more than enough to help someone heal and let go of something that has been bothering them their whole lives. So to come back to your question, perhaps where do I see it going in the future? I don't know. I honestly feel a bit skeptical about regulation and legalization in the sense of it becoming another medical practice, it becoming over-medicalized, it becoming over-clinical, it becoming patented and costly, and or one entity saying that you can only buy it through us or work through us, and you need to qualify as having treatment-resistant depression, meaning that you have already had to be part of the system that many people don't or no longer identify with or believe in. For example, that you can only qualify for MDMA-assisted therapy if you have already tried everything and tried all the medication and it hasn't worked and you're still here. And now finally, at the very downstream, tip, here you go, you can work with MDMA-assisted therapy. So I, unfortunately, am a little bit skeptical of this whole kind of for-profit and or even regulatory legalization model, at least in its current form.
Got it. Mehran, is there anything else you would like to talk about?
It's been great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity, and I just wanted to extend for anyone interested. I'm quite open, I'm quite receptive, I'm quite willing to share anything, the little thing that I have learned over this exciting, adventurous lifetime with others. So please feel free to reach out to me, and I will try my best to
I'll leave a link to your website and to your social media, also your podcast, which is one of the most popular Persian podcasts about psychedelics. I'll leave a link on the show notes. And I would like to dedicate this episode to the memory of your beloved father, who wasn't just a hero to you. He has been a hero for many Iranians, and what he has done for the Iranian environment and nature is very sacred in my view. And he has left you as a legacy which we will cherish. And I give thanks to your father and your mother for raising such a beautiful soul. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.